You are listening to SRM Insider. This is the Cyber Intelligence Briefing, your weekly roundup of the latest cybersecurity news and insights, straight from SRM's leading global incident response team. This is the second episode of SRM's Cyber Intelligence Briefing. I'm Kyle Schwaeble. I'd usually be joined by my colleagues Miles Arkwright and James Teitler, but both are taking a well-deserved break today and will rejoin the podcast from next week. In their place, we'll hear from a few other experts on SRM's incident response team. This week, I'll be going over 6 key stories. Starting with international news, the Red Cross has issued new cyber warfare rules. NATO seems to have suffered a data breach. A sophisticated phishing campaign targeting senior US executives has been uncovered. There are critical patches from both Atlassian and Apple. We'll look at some of the latest malware developments, and then we'll talk about some recent news relating to the cost of a cyber attack. The International Committee of the Red Cross, which is a humanitarian organization focused on protecting victims of violence and armed conflicts, has issued a set of 8 rules for civilian hackers to follow during conflict. These rules come in response to the growing role of cyber attacks in warfare, particularly evident, I think, in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, where we've seen a strong presence of civilian hackers on both sides of the conflict. The 8 rules are as follows. Firstly, do not direct cyber attacks against civilian objects. Second, do not use malware or other tools or techniques that spread automatically and damage military objectives and civilian objects indiscriminately. Essentially, I think what they're saying here, they're referring to self-propagating and worming malware. The third rule is, when planning a cyber attack against a military objective, do everything feasible to avoid or minimize the effects your operation may have on civilians. The fourth rule is, do not conduct any cyber operation against medical and humanitarian facilities. The fifth, do not conduct any cyber attack against objects indispensable to the survival of the population or that can release dangerous forces. The sixth rule is, do not make threats or violence to spread terror among the civilian population. Seventh, do not incite violations of international humanitarian law. And then lastly, the 8th rule is comply with these rules, even if the enemy does not. So I think the general thrust of the rules is to try and limit the harm that cyber attacks can cause to ordinary civilians. It's certainly a positive move from the Red Cross, but I think the big question is, whether these rules will have any real impact and whether hackers will actually follow them at all. In another story relating to an international organization, it seems as if NATO has suffered a data breach. The hacktivist group SiegedSec has claimed responsibility for leaking 9 gigabytes of NATO data on a Telegram channel. The data is allegedly from one of NATO's unclassified websites. When a threat actor claims to have stolen data, it can sometimes be quite difficult for an organization to really understand the scope and extent of a data breach. So in order to respond effectively to these scenarios, I'd advise organizations to conduct a data discovery exercise and try and identify, what data they hold and where it's located. Moving on, a sophisticated phishing campaign that's been targeting senior executives, predominantly at US-based organizations, has been uncovered. Evil Proxy, it's a phishing as a service platform, and it's being used in this new campaign that's exploiting a vulnerability in the Indeed employment website. And the purpose is to try and trick users into providing their username and password. What makes Evil Proxy and this campaign as well particularly challenging is that it uses techniques to bypass traditional email security controls like multi-factor authentication, or MFA. I've asked Chris Ormond, who heads up SRM's incident response team in the UK, to just join us briefly and talk through some of the controls that one can take to mitigate against this threat. So Chris, most people are familiar with MFA and they use it on a daily basis, but I think it's well accepted that some forms of MFA, they're just not sufficient anymore. Is that right?
Absolutely, Kyle. Gone are the days where any MFA was the silver bullet against credential theft. Criminal groups are developing and employing more sophisticated phishing mechanisms all the time. The most effective one being their movement to an adversary in the middle attack. This means that they can not only steal credentials, but also session cookies, which crucially contain your MFA access tokens. With this new approach and leveraging well-known and recognizable company websites to facilitate this theft, it's now much more risky to just implement MFA. As with all security solutions, it's about the configuration, not just the implementation.
That makes a lot of sense, Chris. But practically, what can organizations do to mitigate or defend against this threat?
That's a great question, Kyle. Well, the most effective method is to implement a FIDO2 MFA token using things such as the new Windows Hello for Business program or YubiKeys as the most common examples.
Chris, I think you'd appreciate that not everyone listening today will know what a FIDO2 token is. Do you mind just briefly explaining that?
Of course, implementing this will make every input of an MFA token completely unique and will stop the theft of a token being used on a brand new session.
Well, what about the normal app-based authenticators that we use on our phones?
Well, actually, you may want to steer clear of those as much as possible. This may lead to something called notification fatigue, where users may accidentally accept a request from a criminal after accepting multiple notifications per day.
Chris heads up SRM's incident response team. Thanks, Chris. There have been a couple of critical vulnerabilities disclosed this past week. The first and potentially most impactful relates to Atlassian's Confluence platform. Confluence is a major collaboration and documentation tool used by millions of companies globally. It can be hosted by Atlassian, but many organizations choose to instead host the platform themselves. Both the data center and server software are vulnerable, so this has a potentially far-reaching impact. Ineta Simkunaite, a senior analyst and technical lead on SRM's incident response team, has joined us, and she's going to provide a brief overview of the vulnerability and what affected organizations can do about it.
Thanks, Kyle. Excited to be here. And that's absolutely right. Atlassian has issued a security advisory regarding a recently discovered zero-day vulnerability. The security flaw is highly exploitable and enables threat actors to illicitly create Confluence administrator accounts and gain access to Confluence instances. Now, good news, however, that patches are available. If your organization is using the affected software, it's crucial to update to the fixed version immediately. If you can't apply the update right away, we recommend restricting external network access to your vulnerable systems until you can implement those patches. This can help reduce the risk of exploitation. Also, if you're running affected software, you should be on the lookout for indicators of compromise published in the advisory.
Thanks, Ineta. Apple has also released a patch for a privilege escalation vulnerability affecting iPhone and iPad, so make sure you're updating to the latest software release as well. Before we get to the final story, I just wanted to quickly touch on the fact that it seems that threat actors behind Qakbot still seem to be operating despite the recent law enforcement action that took down the botnet network recently. There have also been reports of a new malware service called BunnyLoader that is being distributed on underground forums and marketplaces. It's got numerous malicious functionalities, but it only costs around $250. So it just goes to show how cheap it can be for these attackers to get their hands on sophisticated tools. Finally, a couple stories that came out this week have really highlighted just how expensive a cyber attack can be. Firstly, Blackbaud, which develops and distributes various management software products, suffered a ransomware attack in 2020. They've just agreed to a legal settlement of almost $50 million relating to the incident. The company was accused of missing several fundamental security controls and not adequately notifying data subjects of the breach. Separately, MGM Resorts, who you may recall suffered a ransomware attack last month, they've reported a loss of around $100 million in revenue as a result of the incident. That doesn't even include the additional $10 million that they had to pay for remediation and legal fees in response to the attack. I was talking to Roddy Priestley, a director in SRM cyber practice, about these two stories, and he had some interesting thoughts, particularly around the role of cyber insurance. Roddy, thanks for joining us. Would you mind sharing some of your thoughts with our listeners?
Yeah, thanks, Carl. I mean, for me, these stories this week are a stark reminder that cyber events can have far-reaching and long-lasting impacts. Here we are in 2023, and still the reputational damage and the enormous costs of the breach that Blackbaud suffered is still rumbling on. The MGM breach in the last few weeks goes to show just how quickly losses can escalate from damage to systems, and the inability of the organization to operate effectively. Many firms will consider obviously the maturity of their security controls, but too few actually consider the quantum of their business interruption losses as part of their response readiness. And one of the important benefits from an insurance-led response is the speed at which the panel can deploy to support an organization and set up activities that limit that business interruption as quickly as possible.
Thanks, Roddy. That brings us to an end of this week's episode. Please join us again next week. As always, you can access a written version of this briefing on our website.